Shalom, Bruchim Abayim, and welcome to Shevi'im Panim LaTorah, to 70 Faces of the Torah, and also Sulam Yaakov. This week's Torah portion is Parashat Emor. The word Emor in Hebrew means to speak, and it's in reference to the very first sentence or pasuk or verse in the Torah, in which Hashem commands Moshe Rabbeinu to speak to the sons of Aharon, who we know are the Kohanim. And Parashat Emor is really considered the Torah portion for the Kohanim. It does build off of the themes that we just read in Parashat Kiddushim, which is the theme of Kedusha or holiness, which is something I discussed in a previous teaching, which is a process of becoming. Holiness is not something that is a ceremonial look. It's not a religious appearance per se. It's not something that one attains or masters overnight. It's a process of becoming. And so much of what was injected in last week's Torah portion is carried over into this week's Torah portion, but with greater emphasis on the Kohanim. And so as the Torah has prohibited us from coming in contact with anything that is tuma, anything that carries impurity, which once again is impervious to our physical senses, therefore an average Israelite may be able to come in contact, let's say, with a deceased relative, God forbid, such as a mother or father. However, we see that when the laws are applied to the Kohen HaGadol, the high priest, the Torah puts a more strict fence around him, and therefore he cannot get contract, if you will, tumath mate, if you will, through a dead corpse, let's say, as an Israelite could, or an average Jew. So there's a lot of things that we see here that really require separate studies on their own. I mean, an interesting topic, study I do have in reference to this Torah portion. One is dealing with the issue of the Hebrew calendar. In today's day and age, we do not have Suddakim, which are known as Sadducees, which is one of the prevailing groups that existed 2,000 years ago during the time of the Bayit Sheni, the Second Temple. But what we do have is, I would say, is their spiritual descendants, and those are the Karaite. The Karaite movement are, well, in a way, they're not identical to the Sadducees, because the Sadducees only held to the 5 books of Moshe. In other words, they rejected the prophets, they rejected the writings, and primarily because they believed that those books of what we call the Hebrew Bible were largely rabbinic in nature. Okay, the concept of the Torah Shabbat Pei, the oral Torah, finds also their origins through the writings of those books as well. Karaites will use the Hebrew Bible per se, which is kind of strange and an oxymoron to a certain degree, even though they reject rabbinical writings such as the Mishnah or the Gemara and things of that nature. Not that they completely flat out reject them. They do use them for historical references, but they do not abide by them when it comes to halakha and things of that nature. So anyway, in this other teaching I have dealing with the Hebrew calendar, it deals with the counting of Sfirat Omer, which we're currently in the middle of. And it's very interesting. The Torah does not give us an actual demarcation of time, right, when it comes to count the Omer. So we find in chapter 23, this week's Torah portion, the Torah tells us that we are to usfartem lachem, that you shall count. And this is a command to the Sanhedrin, who was to relate us to the society of Israel, the Jewish people, that they are to count. Okay, there should be 7 complete weeks, 50 days. And that this counting would bring us to the next holiday that we know as Shavuot, Kabbalat Torah, the receiving of the Torah, also known as Hag HaBechurim, the Feast of the First Fruits. And what's interesting in there is that Shavuot is not spelled out with a definitive date. Like when we take a look at the other Chagim that are mentioned, Pesach, Sukkot, etc., Shemini Atzeret, these dates are mentioned in the Torah. We know exactly when they are. Okay. However, when it comes to Shavuot, the date is not explicitly mentioned. And so the only way you can decode the date is by paying attention to when we actually count the Omer. And so for those of us who follow the normative mainstream path of Judaism, we begin counting the Omer on the second Seder night, at least in the diaspora. There's 2 Seders. In Eretz Israel, there's only one. And so that is the 16th of Nisan, right at sunset from the 15th to the 16th. That's when we begin counting the Omer. The issue with the Karaites and those before them, their spiritual predecessors, the Sadducees, they believe that the phrase in the Torah, Mimacharat HaShabbat, the day after Sabbath, literally is what that translates as, is a reference to the weekly Sabbath, which is Saturday. So as soon as sun sets on Saturday night, Motzi Shabbat, that is when they would begin counting the Omer. However, we should all know, even a Karaite should know, that a Shabbat is not limited to the weekday Shabbat. Okay, the weekly Shabbat, I should say. Rather, Pesach functions as Shabbat. These are what's called Shabbatons in the Torah. And therefore, we go by this demarcation of when Pesach falls, and therefore we count from there. And the teaching I have actually is very interesting because it's not so much based upon just rabbinic quotations of what we find in the Mishnah and the Gemara, or Boraitot, things of that nature, and rabbinical commentaries. Rather, it's just based upon actually the study of the Hebrew language. Just straight from the Peshat of the Hebrew, we actually learn how we can actually decipher when we begin counting the Omer. And it's unique when you look at Hebrew hermeneutics. This is how you can actually discover it. And I have a unique teaching on that, which also paces in the passages from Sefer Yehoshua, the book of Joshua, that shows that. And so that's another teaching I have on that. Another unique teaching deals with who are the Kohanim. It's a very interesting, controversial topic because anyone who's ever spent any time in the Beit Knesset, in the synagogue, you'll know that when it's time to receive a aliyah to the Torah, there is first room made for a Kohen, if there's one available in the synagogue. If not, then there's a Levi. Obviously, if there's no Levi, then we look for average Israelite, a Jew. And so the idea is if someone is recognized as a Kohen, they get the first honors, etc. And so many people are under the impression that they are legitimate Kohanim today. And what do I mean by that is that they're a descendant of Aharon. And the truth is that's not accurate. And this is not my opinion on it. This is actually supported by many rabbinical commentaries and going back to history, in which there was a big divergence within the movement of the Kohanim amongst the tribe of Levi, which ultimately goes all the way back to the time of the Chashmonaim, the Maccabean era, in which eventually the Maccabees, after defeating Antiochus, that they eventually established themselves as basically kingly rulers, okay, instead of just priests. And then eventually, we're all familiar with Hanukkah, and we celebrate the story and the nace that happened. But a lot of people don't follow up with the dark history that happens after that shortly, in which internal fighting over who would have power took place, and eventually that made an inway for the Herodian family to come in via forced conversion to Judaism, and eventually a peace party with Rome, and the rest is history from there. And so the internal fighting amongst the Essenes, who also were legit Kohanim according to the Dead Sea Scrolls via the line of Sadok, who was mentioned in the book of Ezekiel, largely made up the Essene movement. Also were known as the Sikharim. These were the Zealots as well. They were a part of the same faction operating from out the Galil, the Galilee, and they were at war with their cousins in the south of Judea, the oligarchy, protecting the treasury on behalf of Rome, which was the Sadducean movement. So it was a very interesting topic, and in fact, I have teachings that deal with this, that deal with issues of the New Testament, especially for those in Messianic Judaism and Christianity. It's a commentary that I've been working on that deals with the New Testament, but from a historical approach. And therefore, it's very controversial because it doesn't pander to theology or beliefs. It goes into actual factual teachings and historical artifacts, things of that nature. So nonetheless, with that said, let me digress back here instead of just going on with a lengthy introduction. I have subtitled this teaching, Sacred Place and Time. It's a relatively short teaching, but I believe it gets to the point of what the Torah is trying to convey to us. And so in this week's Torah portion, we read once again an interesting array of subjects that don't technically appear to be related to each other, but they are. And we see that the Torah begins by speaking about the obligations of the Kohanim, especially in relation to the laws of Tumah. And once again, Tumah, which we translate as impurity, is not really a good equivalent to the Hebrew word Tumah. Tumah, Tahara, as I explained in the previous teachings, they don't have a equivalence in translation. There's no vernacular word that we could pick up on in English or any other language for that matter to actually understand it. And therefore, this is not impurity in the sense of something physical like hygienic. It deals with energy, okay? And so we see here that the Torah stresses this, especially in relation to the Kohanim. And we see that the Torah mentions that if a Kohen becomes tameh, they become impure, that individual is ineligible to serve in the kahuna, okay? They basically have removed themselves from being able to serve in the temple, the Mishkan, etc. And so from there, the Torah then speaks about what is known as Mouadi Hashem, which we translate as the appointed times or the appointed festivals of Hashem, where the Torah speaks about the observance of Shabbat, Pesach, Hachamatzot, Sfirat Omer, Shavuot, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, and Shemini Atzeret. And after mentioning the Mouadi Hashem, the Torah then focuses on the Menorah and the Lechem Panim, which is interesting that the Torah focuses on these two specific kelim or vessels out of the entire Mishkan system. Fascinating, but why is that? So Parashat Emor, once again, is known as the Torah portion for the Kohanim. Even though all of Vayikra Leviticus is related to the Kohanim, especially to the nation of Israel, as they're supposed to be considered a Mamlechet Kohanim V'Goy Kodesh, a holy nation of kings and priests, Parashat Emor is focused on the specific attributes of the Kohanim. And so from the Peshat, or the basic interpretation of the Torah, it would appear the reason why the Torah juxtaposes the Kohanim with the subject matter of Tumah to the appointed festivals of Hashem, and finally the Menorah and the Lechem Panim, is because the Kohanim were the ones responsible for teaching the people the difference between Ben Kodesh uven Tameh and Lechol Tahor, between the mundane and also the sacred, right? Between the profane and the holy. That's something that's brought down in the Haftarah to this week's Torah portion, which is in Sefer Yehezqel, specifically in Ezekiel chapter 44, verse 23. Now, as part of the Sanhedrin, okay, the Kohanim sat within the Sanhedrin. They were responsible for the Jewish calendar and deciding when the people observed God's appointed times, such as Pesach, the counting of the Omer, etc. Okay? The Hebrew calendar we follow today is a fixed calendar, which is remarkable considering that the Hebrew calendar is lunar base, okay? And you got to keep in mind that 2,000 something years ago, with the fixed calendar we have today, there was no scientific instruments to determine the cycles, okay, of how to make sure each date falls out. Because if we follow a solar calendar, like some of the nations do, you would actually have Pesach sometimes veering back into the winter season. It would be completely off. And so through the wisdom that was preserved, okay, by the sages, eventually we have a codification of a fixed calendar. Now that is subjected to change once there is an inauguration of a kosher Sanhedrin, okay, once those return back. And that's important as well, because then that all changes. And so the Sanhedrin were responsible for how it came to counting the Omer, okay, and many other things. However, beneath the Peshat, we discover another message the Torah is trying to teach us in this week's Torah portion. So, to be able to understand the reason why the Torah juxtaposes the subject matter of Tumah, Moadim, and the Kelim in relation to the Kohanim, we first need to understand the subject matter that was brought from previous Parshiyot. So for the past two Shabbats, we have had what's considered double Parshiyot. And normally we read double Parshiyot in a non-leap year, versus when we're in a leap year, we tend to read double Parshiyot separate. So for instance, back in Parashat Tazria Mitzorah, okay, we read those together verse separate in non-leap years. And also the beginning of Achrei Mot, as well as Kiddushim, We see in those parshiot, the Torah taught about the laws of Tuma and Tahara, all right? But at the end of Acharemot and Kiddushin, the Torah taught about the laws of Kedusha. And so when you analyze this juxtaposition, it's not just coincidental, it's not random. The laws of Kedusha teach us about creating a space of holiness. And that holiness specifically is for other people, because one of the things that we learn, as I mentioned before, is the Torah speaks about forbidden relations, okay? And not to emulate or practice or be influenced by the secular world, or in the Torah's term, the 7 Canaanite nations. And this is reflected in the statement that we read in Parashat Kiddushin, Kiddushin tiyu ki kadosh ani Adonai Elohechem, that you should also become holy. It's a process of becoming, because that's what Hashem is. And that teaches the reason why we create a space of holiness for others is because Hashem himself created a space for us to exist in his holiness, a process of becoming. This is why also on a very deep mystical level in Jewish thought, God is not a noun. Not a noun. God is a verb. And even that is said with some type of nebulous understanding, because as I explained many times, the identity of the Creator in the Torah is not fully understood, because we only have titles of the Creator. The Borei is mentioned here, which is why on a more Kabbalistic level, the Creator is also known as the Ein Sof, the infinite, endless one that you can't really describe except for whatever revelation that the Creator reveals himself through the mind via this revelation of the Torah. And so what we see here is that there's a process of becoming, okay, like a verb. It's a process, it's a motion. God created this space for us to be able to exist in his holiness, and therefore we emulate that to create a space for others to exist in that holiness as well. So the Torah's subject matter, providing for the poor, not violating the nakedness of another person, which can also not just be literal nakedness, like nudity, but also vulnerability, not damaging another person's property. It captures the essence of Kedusha. In relation to other people's space, the Torah tells us to create a special place for holiness for God, which is what we know as the Mishkan or the Beit HaMikdash. This is where Parashat Emor comes into play. In this week's Torah portion, the Torah focuses once again specifically on the Kohanim, because the Kohanim are dedicated to Hashem's sacred space. They are dedicated to the Mishkan. This is where they perform the avodah, the worship, the service, the work to God. They don't have any property. They have nothing, because their entire life is dedicated to the ways of God. Therefore, they survive off of the tithes of the people that go into the temple system. And therefore, this is their life, this is their lot. And so as people dedicated to God's sacred space, the Kohanim, they're prohibited from coming in contact with any forms of Tumah, even Tumat mate, somebody who is dead, such as a distant cousin or a close friend. The Torah only permits Kohanim to draw near to an immediate family member, such as a mother, a father, a brother, sister, or wife. Now, in regard to the average Jew, the Torah permits the average Jew to come in contact with the dead who are not an immediate family member. And so the dichotomy between a Kohen and non-Kohen is that death is to remind a person of God, who is the source of all life. However, when a person is mourning the loss of a loved one, they are not fully conscious of God's presence, which is why the Torah prohibits a non-Kohen from entering the Mishkan. And this is also why, on a very deep psychological level, there is the custom of basically reciting the mourner's Kaddish that an immediate family member says for 11 months when a loved one is nifter or deceased. Why 11 months? You know, and there's various interpretations, but one of the things that stuck out to me is that a person who doesn't always understand the ways of God and the mysterious ways when a loved one departs from this realm, they may not have that great of a connection with Hashem. But by reciting the Kaddish, which is definitely not a prayer to the dead, you don't mention the name of the deceased at all, it's preserved in Aramaic, Yikada v'yikadash me'rabah, we say, we're exalting the name of God. That's the entire thing. And what that does is to penetrate the subconscious mind of the mourner to remind him that there is a creator. Therefore, he's to be exalted and praised. And everything that happens, even in the situation of a loved one passing, has been designed and engineered by the divine mind of Hashem. And therefore, that person who doesn't always understand why things happen, come to understand the phrase that's in the Torah, Ein od milvado. There is no other reality but God. And so the Torah allows the non-Kohen to mourn and to endure a waiting period of Tumah and Tahara until they can enter God's sacred space, which is normally to bring a korban. And this is the dichotomy between a non-Kohen and a Kohen. A non-Kohen has the option of entering God's sacred space, while a Kohen, on the other hand, is actually a part of God's sacred space. And so the Kohen must always have the presence of God permeating before him. As David HaMelech says in Psalm 16:8, Shiviti Adonai Lanegdi Tamid. I place Hashem always before me. Tamid, continuously. This is also why when you study the Tanakh, the prophet Yehezqel ben Buzi, when tragically he lost his wife, God did not permit him to cry. It's not that Yehezqel was to become desensitized to the death of his wife, but as a Kohen, and many people don't realize this, that all your major prophets in the Hebrew Bible were Kohanim. Yehezqel understood that God is the source of life, and the physical absence of a person from this world is proof of the soul making its transition to another realm. Okay? And this is also what the Torah commands the Jewish people in the beginning of this week's Torah portion, not to engrave themselves with tattoos. Now, mind you, the command is directly to the Kohanim, but Israel is called the Mamleket Kohanim. So do not gash themselves where they physically mutilate their skin. Okay, back in the day, still practiced today as well amongst Gentiles. They just are not aware of the custom. It's just been watered down and mixed with certain religious practices. Is that when a Gentile lost a loved one, they would do some strange afflictions in their body, whether they would gash themselves with a prong or something hot, gash themselves with something, and carve the memory of that loved one within a part of their body, whether it was up here on their bicep area, their shoulder, maybe on their abdomen, their back, their thigh, whatever. Or they would rip their hair out and permanently causing balding, okay? And same thing with the beard, they would pull it out and they would cause basically permanent damage to the hair follicles. And so the reason why the non-Jew did that is because they never believed that that person's soul continues. This life is the only life you have, and that's it. Once you pass, you pass. The Jew, on the other hand, is told not to do that because the soul continues on. There's no need to mourn or afflict yourself in such a degrading way. Therefore, it's a time to grieve. We grieve, yes. But then the grieving process passes, and you exalt the name of the Almighty. The soul is eternal. This is also why at Jewish funerals, it's not custom to have open caskets like they call the wake, right? Why is it closed caskets at Jewish funerals? And mind you, I'm not speaking for non-observant Jews. I'm speaking about observant Jews because I know in the non-observant Jews, they have their own practices as well. But for the observant community, it's always closed caskets, and the body is put in the ground no more, less than up to 72 hours, 3 days max. No embalming, no nothing. The reason why it's a closed casket is because you don't want to remember the image of that person, that friend, that loved one, without the breath of life in them. The body is only a temporal suit that the soul wears. This is also why it's customary where flowers are not normally brought to a Jewish cemetery. Not that one couldn't, they could, but usually there's always rocks on top of the tombs. Why? A rock is something that has been here longer than many of us. It's symbolic of the memory of this loved one will endure forever, right? Dor vador, from one generation to the next. Flowers, they come and they fade, right? So anything that reminds us of a person in a healthy image is what we preserve. Not in a decomposing, zombie-like look state. We don't do that. It's not natural, okay? And so with this information, we now come to the Kohanim being juxtaposed to the Mouadi Hashem. So besides the fact that the Kohanim were responsible as members of the Sanhedrin to determine the Jewish calendar to observe certain holidays, what is the connection between the Kohanim and these appointed times of God? Let's take a look here at Vayikra, Leviticus 23, verse 1 through 2. Torah says, Vaydaber Adonai el Moshe lemor, daber el bnei Israel v'amata alehem, Mouadi Hashem asher tikra'u otam. Mirai chodesh elechem mo'adai. Hashem said to Moshe, saying, speak to the children of Israel and say to them, Hashem's appointed times/festivals that you are designated as literally holy callings, we call convocations. These are my appointed times. So we say here festivals. So Hashem wanted the moadim to be defined as kodesh. We see here, mikra'e kodesh. Kodesh, once again, deals with the laws of kedusha, sanctification, separation, etc. So what do we find in the previous parashiyot is that kedusha deals with space, such as property, which can refer to either a person or, let's say, a thing, such as the Mishkan. When the Torah refers to the appointed festivals, such as Shabbat or Pesach or Sukkot, as these Mouday Hashem, the phrase Mouday Hashem is teaching us that we are to make a special place for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So how does this work? When the Torah commanded the construction of the Mishkan, it commanded us to create a sacred space that is for the Shekhinah, for the presence of God. Ve'asuli mekdash ve'shachante betocham. Now, betochai, I would dwell in it, but betocham, toch means in, betocham means in them. Okay? And so it was only after the sin of the Chet HaEgel, the golden calf, that we had a physical building to remind us that it's a microcosm of the human being, which I've taught in previous teachings on the subject. And so we were commanded to create a sacred space that is for the Shekhinah, and from there the Torah stipulated how we are to respect that space. So how does the Moadei Hashem, such as Shabbat, take on that same quality? Well, Shabbat is not a Mishkan. It is greater than a Mishkan, which is why in Jewish law, the 39 forbidden laws of labor are derived for the Yemei HaChol, the weekly activities that one conducted when building the Mishkan. Whatever you did during the week, you refrain from, because the Mishkan does not take precedence over Shabbat. The phrase Moadei Hashem teaches us how Shabbat, Pesach, Sukkot, etc. take on the same nature as the Mishkan. Another unique aspect to Kedusha besides space is time. When you make time for someone, you are giving them a part of your life. Now, many of us are familiar with the song, Cats in the Cradle, right? If you don't know that song, okay, then go look it up. Cats in the Cradle is a sad song. It's about a father who never had time for his son. And when he got older and wanted to spend time with his son, who now becomes his own man, with his own family, it was too late, because the son is now too busy with his own family and life, and he's too busy for his father. So the idea of making time for somebody you live with seems strange, right? And maybe we can relate to that in today's modern day and age, in which everybody is so preoccupied and busy with their cell phone and with the plethora of social media. You got so many different platforms to check things out on. It's like it's just information overkill, especially with information that's not even essential to the development of your growth. And so many people are in their home, husbands and wives sit in the bed with cell phones, or at the dinner table with kids, cell phones. There's no kesher, there's no connection. You occupy the same space as the other person, but you don't make time to spend with them. Making a place for another person is not about space, but about time. And so the phrase Moadei Hashem teaches us about the holiness of time. Moadei Hashem is not just about spending time in God's sacred space. It's not about the Beit Knesset, the synagogue, the Mishkan, or Beit HaMikdash, right? It's not about just showing up there. Rather, it's about spending time with God. We go here, Leviticus 23, verse 3, and the Torah tells us, "Sheshet yamin te'aseh melacha uvayom hashvi'i Shabbat Shabbatom micha chodesh." For 6 days, work may be done. However, the 7th day is a day of complete rest. It's a holy calling, a convocation. Kol melacha lo ta'asud. You shall not perform any melacha work on it. Produce it. Shabbat hi la'Adonai bechol moshevotechem. It's a Shabbat for Hashem. That's what it says, La Adonai, for God. And therefore, in all, bechol, all moshevotechem, all your dwelling places. And so here, Hashem tells us that for 6 days, the world is ours. We can plan, we can build, we can strategize, analyze, and master our potential to fulfill our dreams. We have the power to create, to make money, to generate our own industry. However, the 7th day belongs to Him. And so the Shabbat is when God asks us to spend time with Him. Now, the word moed in Hebrew, it literally means appointment. Think about it. Whenever we need to see a doctor, a lawyer, a dentist, or somebody important, what do we do to see them? We have to see them by appointment, right? We need to make an appointment with them. Now, how would you feel if you went to see your doctor, your dentist, or maybe your mechanic, right? And you make an appointment with them, and you show up, and instead of that individual focusing their time on you, they're focusing it on somebody else. I mean, how would it make you feel? It'll make you upset. Like, what's wrong with you? Like, I'm here, right? What's going on? Or when a couple's in the bed together, and they're at the dining table, one's on the cell phone, they're not talking to their significant other or their children. Like, you're on the cell phone on the social media, put it down. They feel upset. So the Torah tells us that when it comes to Mouday Hashem, we can't make excuses like the father in the Cats in the Cradle song, that we are too busy. Many of us may be in a sacred space on Shabbat. We may be inside of the synagogue. But are we truly giving our time to God on Shabbat? Are we truly spending time with Hashem on Shabbat? Even though the non-Kohen was not required to spend all their time with God, okay, like the Kohanim were, when it came to Shabbat and the other Mouday Hashem, the Torah wanted to impress upon the non-Kohanim that when it comes time to those special holidays, they needed to be like the Kohanim. Okay, on those specific days, they needed to make sure that they understood that Shabbat, Pesach, etc., that they are part of God's sacred space. And what makes them a part of God's sacred space is their time. And this now brings us to the subject of the Menorah and the Lechem Panim that appear in this week's Torah portion as we take a look here in Leviticus 24, verse 1 through 4. Hashem spoke to Moshe, saying, Savet b'nei Israel, command the children of Israel. Sav is in the imperative too. It's urgent. And we find the same passage, the same command goes back to Parashat Tetzaveh, by the way. If you want to compare the two, when the menorah was first introduced, they shall take for you clear olive oil, press for lamaor ha'aloth ner tamid, for illuminating, to kindle a continual lamp. Okay, and it says it's michutz laparochet haidut beohel moed. It's outside the menorah. When inside the Yehezqel, the sanctuary, is positioned outside of the partition of the testimony, meaning it's outside the Holy of Holies, which is inside the tent of meeting. And now, literally, the tent of meeting in Hebrew, ohel, means tent. Moed is appointment, right? It's where you met God, by appointment. Yaruch otzo Aharon, and it says, Aaron shall arrange me'erav ad boker, from evening till morning, lifnei Hashem, before Hashem, tamid, continuously, non-stop. Chuchat olam, it's an eternal decree, ledorotechem, for all your generations, which means it's not just limited to what happened thousands of years ago, it's still contingent today. Because without a physical Mishkan or a physical menorah, these are microcosms that represent us, which means the same halachic guidelines there apply here. El ha-menorah, and therefore on the pure menorah, okay, he shall arrange the lamps continuously, lifnei Hashem, before Hashem. Very, very interesting passage we see here. The Torah has already made it known back in Parashat Trumah, the responsibility of the Kohanim to light the menorah and to bake loaves of fresh bread. That's what's called the lechem, the shochan lechem panim, the table, right, of the bread of faces. So why the redundancy? Why come along a chumash later towards the end of Leviticus and repeat what we read back in Parashat Tetzaveh? Why? Obviously the Torah is not redundant on purpose. Assume that we fell asleep back then and we forgot. Why? But why is the Torah being superfluous then? Well, throughout the verses of the Menorah and the Lechem Panim, we find the word tamid being repeated over and over. Tamid, tamid, tamid. It's 3 times in this verse. Okay, verses 1 through 4 I have highlighted here in yellow. Why? The word tamid captures the essence of time, which is why tamid means at all times or continuous. It's eternal. The Torah says that the Menorah and the Lech Panim must be before Hashem at all times. And while the Menorah and Lech Panim exist within the space of God, meaning the Mishkan, their symbolism is not about space, but about time. For the Kohanim, the message is evident. The reason why they must avoid Tumah is because they are present with God at all times. The presence of God permeates their life every second, and as soon as they stop spending quality time with God, that is when they desecrate God's sacred space. Leviticus 21:6. Kedoshim Yehuah Elohechem. They, Kohanim, shall be holy to their God. V'lo yechalelu shem Elohechem, and they shall not desecrate the name of their God. Ki et ishel lechem, for the fire offerings of Hashem, the bread lechem Elohechem, Haim machrivim v'hayu kodesh, that they draw near to offer, they must remain kodesh, they must remain sanctified. And so once again, if they become tame's energy that permeates and connects with thoughts, which means there's a severance of their connection with Hashem. The channel below to the channel above, there's a severance of that connection, which is why that Kohen, once they become Tameh, they are now puzzle, if you will. Their service is invalid. They cannot be used. A lot of people not very familiar with how the Avodah system worked in those days. The Kohanim worked in silence. Their connection, everything was done via kavanah, okay? Everything was done through the attention of machshavot, through their thoughts. And so everything that they did corresponded with the seat of their soul, connection of the mind to God, their consciousness. And so this is what the Torah is trying to teach us here, that basically, that as soon as they stop that time, that consciousness with God, that's when they desecrate God's sacred space. Desecration, okay, what we call a chilul Hashem, is where we get in modern Hebrew, someone's called a chiluni, which is what you call a secular Jew or Israeli, but it literally means a desecrator. That's what it means in Hebrew, not a very polite thing to call someone. It's a very strong term. It's a chiluni. And a chiluni is not just limited to a secular Israeli. You could become a chiluni just based upon a severance of your connection with the Ribbono Shel Olam. And so the Torah is teaching us that the Kohen who falls short of Kedusha is guilty of creating desecration. When the Torah mentions that the Kohen offers lechem Elohechem, okay, the bread of God, this is a reference to the Torah's command of having the lechem panim before God tamid, continuously. And I don't have the quote here, but Chazal tell us that when the lechem panim was done, it was always done on Shabbat. Okay, it was always produced fresh on Shabbat. And that from one Shabbat to the next Shabbat, the lechem panim will remain fresh all week. It didn't become stale, okay? It's not like when you go to the shuk in Israel and you have these guys yelling out, tarik, tarik, they're saying this is fresh, fresh bagels, and the thing looks stale as I don't know what. Like it's like a brick. You could hit someone in the head or break a window with it. No, the lechem panim was fresh all week from one Shabbat to the next. And this is considered a miracle. But that's not the primary focus, that, the bread remained fresh all week. No, that's not the focus, because it's a microcosm. The freshness of the bread was symbolic of the Kohen, or the Kohanim, who maintain a fresh relationship before Hashem, never going stale, never letting life dry them out. And so for the non-Kohen, the message should be evident as well, that even though non-Kohanim do not have the same burdens as the Kohanim by spending all their time with God, the Torah wanted the non-Kohanim to understand that while God gave them 6 days to conquer the world, on the 7th day and on the respective holidays, they needed to become like the Kohanim and dedicate their entire time to God. They needed to be fresh, always positive, grateful, gratitude. Israel as a nation, once again, is called Mamlechet Kohanim V'Goy Kadosh, a holy nation of kings and priests. And I explained before that term Goy, or sometimes it has a derogatory term when referring to non-Jews, is from the biblical word giviyah, which deals with physiognomy. Physiognomy is the study of studying the traits of a person and what makes them distinct and different. A goy amongst other goyim, right? What makes them distinct and different from the rest of the nations is their character traits of how they spend quality time with their Father in heaven, how they're happy, how they're positive, how they're grateful. And so, if Israel falls short of Kedusha, then chasas chalila, they're guilty of desecrating God's name, which then means the Jews become the target of all the conspiracy theories in the world. And it's without coincidence that when addressing the Mouadi Hashem, the Torah speaks about Sfirat Omer. Now, while Sfirat Omer is not a holiday in itself, it is a command of the Torah to count 50 days or 7 weeks until the intimate rendezvous with Hashem for Shavuot. It's an interesting picture that the Torah is painting when you reflect upon it. When speaking about the laws of Tumah, the Torah tells us that when a woman is impure due to her Seder Nidah, that she must wait a period of 7 days until she can reunite with her husband. The Torah says that between Pesach and Shavuot is a period of 7 weeks, right? Which is symbolic of Israel being like a woman in a state of Nidah. And so the Torah commands us to count, anticipating the day that we can reunite with Hashem in purity. Sfirat Omer is a time to stir within us anticipation to spending time with Hashem on Shavuot. After all, Shavuot is one of the Shalosh Regalim, the required holiday that the men of Israel were required to go to Jerusalem. You had to ascend if you were of good health and youth, okay, at Pesach, and then you come back for Shavuot, and then later on in the fall for Sukkot, and you would say there for Shemini Atzeret as well. And so what we see here is that there's this anticipation of connecting with Hashem. And Kabbalat Torah, receiving the Torah, is not just a one-time event. Every year we should be receiving a different understanding of the Torah, which is why it's called Shevi'im Panim LaTorah, 70 faces. There's different facets like a diamond. And we should all ascend at different levels as well. We shouldn't be at the same place we were last year or the year before that. So with that said, how many of us have been making ample use of Sfirat Omer? How many of us have been utilizing, not just counting, but reflecting, cheshbon hanefesh, introspection? If not, it's only a reflection that we don't make ample time with our time with God. Sure, you might go to shul, Beit Knesset, great, kol hakavod to you, right? But what are you doing at the time on that day, especially when it comes to your family, your community? When most people learn that we are basically towards the end of Sfirat Omer, they act surprised realizing that 49 days have essentially passed. This reaction reveals how little of time people value when it comes to Hashem. Many people are tragically like the father in the Cat in the Cradle song. They're spending all their time working, paying bills, and worrying about tomorrow. And then before you know it, time has passed and nobody has time for them. So Parashat Emor teaches us that a part of Kedusha is not just the space we enter to worship God, but also the time we make to worship God. So I'd like to challenge you as you go through the remaining period of the Omer, and based upon this Torah portion, that you would reevaluate the time that you're spending with Hashem. And that's not just limited to your connection with God, but also how God is perceived in your community and your family and things of that nature. And with that said, Chavarim, that's going to bring us to a close here for our teaching on Parashat Emor. Hope that this teaching has been a blessing to you, a challenge. And also, if our organization is a blessing to you and you would like to donate, you can find the link to donate directly below the video's description. We thank you for your financial support. If you have any questions pertaining the topic or things discussed in this Torah portion, feel free to send me an email. I will answer those in the order that they come in. Until next time, ladies and gentlemen, may the God of Avraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov bless you and your family. Shalom and kol tov.